Hello, we welcome you to the Bible study today. This evening, we'll be looking at Mark chapter 15. We'll look at the first part of the chapter tonight. If you will, please turn in your Bibles to this passage. Mark 15, 1 to 5. In Mark 15, 1 to 5, we see how Jesus is first tried before Pilate. Verse 1. Immediately in the morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. And so here in verse 1, we see how that early in the morning, they held a consultation. And so this word may also be translated as council. This was a meeting or an assembly for discussion, or in this case, as a trial of Jesus. They had had a trial during the night. Here we see some semblance of justice. However, it's just the appearance, something to give form to their proceedings. Mark in verse 12, the consultation or this trial gave an appearance of justice. The outcome was already decided. We learned that from the beginning of the last chapter, Mark 14 and verse 1. According to Matthew's account in Matthew 27 and 1, they plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And so the same thing that we saw in Mark 14 and 1, we see in Matthew 27 and 1, how they plotted to put Jesus to death. Earlier, the high priest, before the high priest, Jesus confessed to being the Christ. Mark 14 and 62. Now, in the morning, they asked the same questions, during which time Jesus confesses to being the Son of God. Also look at Luke 22, 66 to 71, and you can see more details. After they bound Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And so according to Matthew's account, Pilate was Pontius Pilate, the governor, Matthew 27 and verse 2. And so the first three trials are before the Jews, and the last three trials are before the Gentiles, particularly the Romans. Pontius Pilate and Herod, and again, Pontius Pilate, the governor. Verse 15. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And so the governor, Pilate, focused on the accusation that was of the most interest to him. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus responded, "It is as you say." You can also compare this to Matthew 27:11 and Luke 23 and 3. Verse 3. And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And so the chief priest and the elders accused Jesus of all sorts of things. Remember in the last lesson how they tried to find witnesses, false witnesses, to agree, and they had difficulty trying to find two false witnesses that would agree together. Well, we see that they said all sorts of things against Jesus, one of which are some of the things we see in Luke 23 and 2. Luke provides us with more details that we don't see in Mark. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Luke 23 and 2. Mark's account doesn't deal with all of those accusations, but he gives us an abbreviated account. And so we compare the others and we see more details. And we'll look at a few of those in the lesson today. There's so much more that we can learn from studying the individual books of Matthew and Luke and certainly John. We found this fellow perverting the nation. When did he ever do that? When did he ever forbid people to pay taxes to Caesar? Remember how he taught, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God. Saying that he himself is Christ, a king. He certainly is Christ. He is king. In what way is he king? Jesus, however, did not respond to their false accusations. In John's account, Jesus did speak to the governor regarding this one particular accusation, that is, that he is king. He explained his affirmation to be the king. However, his kingdom, he said, was not of this world. And you can read more about that in John 18:33 to 38. So he goes and he describes to Pilate what he meant. Pilate may not have understood, but he recognized that Jesus had not done anything to deserve death. Verse 4. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you." Yes, they certainly said a lot of things against him. And we probably don't have all of those recorded for us today. The things we need to know we have in the scriptures. But we see from the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the things we do know that they said. And here in verse 4, we see how the chief priest accused Jesus of all these things. We should note that they had no supporting evidence. They were unable to find witnesses to even agree. We also see that Pilate was ready to release Jesus. However, they insisted. Luke 23:4-5. Luke 23:4-5. So Pilate said to the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." But they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." And so it says that they stirred up the people. Pilate said to them and to the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." Certainly nothing worthy of death, crucifixion. But they were fierce in their accusations. They said that he stirs up the people. What were they doing? Well, they would stir up the crowd later to call not to release Jesus, but to release Barabbas, a murderer. And yet here they're saying that Jesus stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea. Yes, he taught. He taught in the temple of Judea. He taught beginning in Galilee, and he continued to teach throughout the land, even to this place of Judea, Jerusalem, now being tried. But what had he done? What evil had he done? He had done nothing, nothing wrong. Verse 5, but Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Pilate was amazed, hearing all the things that were said against him, and yet Jesus remained silent. He offered no defense. He requested no assistance, no counselor to defend him. The governor was amazed. We learn from Luke's account that Pilate sent Jesus to be tried afterwards to Herod. He had jurisdiction over Galilee. Well, Herod sent him back to Pilate. Luke 23:6-12. And yet Pilate found nothing of fault in the man. of what they accused him. Number two, we see how Jesus is delivered to be crucified in verses 6 to 15. Verse 6, now at the feast he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And so Governor Pilate had the custom of releasing one prisoner to the multitude. Matthew 27 and 15. The prisoner, whoever they wished to be released, would be released at the feast. Luke 23 and 17. John 18:39, at the feast, or at the Passover feast. And so this was the custom of the time of the governor. Verse 7, and there was one man, one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. And so according to the passage and the other gospel accounts, we see that Barabbas was a notorious prisoner. Matthew 27 and 16. Notorious. He was infamous. He wasn't just famous. He was infamous in the city as a prisoner. He had been thrown into prison for rebellion and for murder. He was a rebel who had committed murder in the rebellion. Where did this rebellion take place? Well, it took place in the city. Luke 23 and 19. That is the city of Jerusalem. We also see from John's account in John 18:40 that Barabbas was not only a murderer and a rebel, but a robber. And so John 18 and 40, he was a robber too. He was not a good man. It appears that he was awaiting his execution. Verse 8, then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. What had he always done for them? Well, according to his custom, releasing one prisoner to them, verse 6, just as they would request. And so here in verse 8, the multitude, that is the crowd that the chief priest stirred up. Mark chapter 15 and verse 11. The chief priests and the scribes, they stirred up the multitude. They stirred up the crowd. They got them all agitated. It caused a tumult. According to Matthew, in Matthew 27 and 20, the chief priest and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. How did they persuade them? The scripture does not say. Perhaps they persuaded them by repeating the false accusations against him. It probably didn't take much for this crowd. These were not Jesus' loyal supporters. Think about the time of day. They just had a trial illegally overnight. And now in the morning, early in the morning, they are bringing him before the Gentiles, before the Romans, to be tried before Pilate, then Herod, and then Pilate again. And so the chief priests and the scribes, they persuaded the multitudes. They got them all riled up. They stirred up the crowd. Without the influence of the chief priest who persuaded and stirred them up, they probably would have requested Jesus to be released and called for Barabbas to be crucified. The multitude cried out to Pilate for him, the governor, to release a prisoner as he was accustomed to do at the feast of Passover of the Jews. Verse 9, but Pilate answered them, saying, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And so Pilate expected that they would call out for him to release to them Jesus. That is, for him to go free while Barabbas to be crucified. He identified Jesus here as the king of the Jews. In Matthew's account reads, Jesus who is called the Christ. Matthew 27 and 17. And so do you want me to release to you the Christ, the King of the Jews? Verse 10. For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. And so he was perceptive enough to see that they had no pure motive in delivering him over to the governor. They did so out of envy, just as we see Mark and Matthew recording. And so the chief priest handed Jesus over because of this emotion of envy. How so? Well, Matthew 27:18 as well. Well, how so? Why were they so envious? Well, they had experienced these emotions of envy, seeing how great the multitudes of people who followed Jesus during his ministry. Think about it. All the passages that we've studied so far in Mark, and we've seen a brief account of the ministry of Jesus, beginning in Galilee and here concluding with his crucifixion in Judea, only later to raise as he had promised. But here we see that they handed him over because of envy. The people left them and followed Jesus. Verse 11. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. And so these chief priests stirred them up. They persuaded them to request that Pilate, the governor, release to them Barabbas. The crowd gathered here that morning knew Barabbas. Again, he was notorious for his crimes in Jerusalem. Pilate expected that the crowd would release Jesus and that he would be released as from his custody. That Barabbas, though, would be crucified, who was a rebel, a murderer, a robber. What did the chief priest say to incite the crowd against Jesus? Again, perhaps the fickle crowds can be fickle, changeable. Perhaps they listened to these false accusations against Jesus and they called out for Barabbas to be released, maybe out of ignorance. Whatever their reason, nothing could justify their evil. They did an evil thing that day, calling out for the life, the blood of an innocent man. And not just an innocent man, but the Christ, the Son of God. Verse 12. Pilate answered and said to them again, "What do you want me to do with him whom you call the King of the Jews?" And so Pilate again asked the crowd, like we saw back in verse 9, "What then do you want me to do with him who's called the King of the Jews?" Or as in Matthew's account, "What shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" Matthew 27:22. Saying that, as they did, with the chief priests in the crowd, calling Jesus the King, the Christ, would only further agitate these envious chief priests. Verse 13. So they cried out again, "Crucify him." And so the crowd, the multitude, cried out for Jesus to be destroyed. Crucify him. They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Matthew 27:22. Verse 14. Then Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." And so the multitude, the crowd, cried out for Governor Pilate to release to them Barabbas and to crucify Jesus. Did they know what they were saying? Were they just following the incitement of these chief priests? Verse 27, Matthew 27:24-25. Matthew adds something in his account that's not in Mark that we'll mention here today. Matthew 27:24. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Think of the evil to say what they said, to do what they did. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail, he expected them to call for Jesus to be released. And instead, they called for Barabbas to be released. When he saw he couldn't prevail, we see him, despite him asking a number of times, he looked around, he saw that a tumult was forming. This mob was rising. He washed his hands of it, we might say. And so we see that figure here. Here he actually took water and washed his hands before the multitude, as if that somehow cleansed him of his responsibility to what was right. I am innocent of the blood of this just person. He was not innocent. We see that he was not a good person either. There's some things that he did. All the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. Verse 15. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. And so ultimately, when he couldn't prevail over the crowd, he bent to their wishes. He released to them Barabbas in order to satisfy them. And after having Jesus scourged, he sent Jesus to be crucified. As you study the other accounts, you learn more details of this horrible event, of the trials and later the crucifixion of Jesus. But here we see in Mark's abbreviated account what Pilate did, what the chief priest did, what the multitude did that day towards this innocent man. As you read the other accounts, Pilate's wife even said having nothing to do with this just person. She saw in a dream. But we see, nevertheless, that Pilate bent to their wishes and released to them Jesus. That is, Jesus to be crucified, and released to them Barabbas to be set free. Even that itself, can you think of the atrocity of a murderer, of a rebel, of a robber being released, and a just person being executed in the most horrific fashion of crucifixion, this slow torture? It's not just the crucifixion, it's all the things leading up to the crucifixion. He didn't deserve any of this. And even Pilate, the governor, admitted this. Verse 15, we see that he scourged him. This isn't just whipping. This is, yes, he was whipped, but the kind of whip that he was whipped with, he was scourged. And so the skin being torn from his flesh torn from his body. Here in this passage, we see that after that was done, then he was sent to be crucified. But before that, we see his mocking. Look what they did in verses 16 to 20. And so verses 16 to 20, we see how he's mocked by the soldiers. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison. The soldiers of the governor led Jesus into the hall called Praetorium. This served as the governor's residence, in this case, Governor Pontius Pilate. But it also served as a judicial court, a judgment hall, if you will, that gathered together the whole garrison around Jesus. Do you remember when we studied earlier, when they came to arrest Jesus? And in John's account, we noted how that they had these soldiers there that day, this detachment there. to take him. Why did they need so many? Did they expect to have a great resistance? And we saw the demonstration of the power of Jesus. Ultimately, it was Jesus who laid down his own life. And we see him doing just that in this passage. Jesus told Peter that if he wished, he could have called angels to set him free. But why did he do it? Well, we see his love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, John 16:16. Here in verse 16, they had the whole garrison. And so the band of soldiers who were stationed there, they called them together to surround him and to mock him. Matthew 27:27. Now here in Mark 15:17, they clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. We read from Matthew's account in Matthew 27:28 that the soldiers stripped him. They stripped him of his clothing. Think of the humiliation. They then clothed Jesus with clothing of purple. Purple was an expensive dye, and in this case, it symbolized royalty. They then took a crown of thorns, twisted the thorns into a crown, and put it on his head to mock him as a king. Matthew 27:29, it says, when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Verse 17, they stripped him of his clothes. They clothed him with purple clothing, symbolizing royalty. They twisted a crown of thorns. They put it upon his head. And they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews. It's hard to read. It's hard to see. They began to salute him, to greet him, mocking him. Hail, King of the Jews. Verse 19, then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshiped him. And so they took a reed. A reed was a stick or a staff. And they took the reed and they hit him on the head. They spat on him. And they bowed the knee as if to worship him, falling down before him. Think of those who worshiped Jesus during his ministry. And now think of the mockery of them worshiping him in this fashion. Matthew 27:30, they spat on him, they took the reed, they struck him on the head. Verse 20, and when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and let him out to be crucified. The scourging alone was horrific. Then to be mocked in this fashion, an innocent man, more so the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, the humiliation, what they did to him, spiritually, physically, spiritually, taking on the sins of the world, physically, stripping him of his clothes, spitting on him, mocking him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple clothes, symbolizing royalty, off of him. They put on his own clothes, and then they let him out to be crucified, where they would nail his hands and feet to a cross. We'll end today with a passage from Mark 10:33 to 34. We've studied this passage, of course. Remember when Jesus foretold his death, burial, and resurrection? When he predicted before his disciples just what they would do to him? Mark 10:33 to 34. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him. And the third day, he will rise again. I wanted to end with that passage, particularly the last part. And the third day, he will rise again. Despite the evil that was brought against Jesus, we see that in the end, he prevailed. He rose again. We'll talk more about that next time, Lord willing, looking at Jesus and his death for our sins. We hope the lesson's been helpful today, and we look forward to the next time that we can continue our study and finish up this chapter of Mark, chapter 15. We invite you to return, come back next time as we study together. Thank you.